Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to LIBOR's Wednesday webinar. My name is Marianne Monteleone, Vice President of Professional Development for LIBOR. April is Fair Housing Month, and each Wednesday we have dedicated our Wednesday webinar to fair housing, diversity, equity, and inclusion, of course. Today's topic, very important topic and timely topic, source of income. And we've invited our friend and guest, Neil Garfinkel, to be our presenter. So let me formally introduce him so I don't miss anything and let you all settle in. Neil Garfinkel is the managing partner of Abrams, Garfinkel, Margolis, Bergson, LLP, a 28-year-old law firm with offices in New York, California, and Long Island. He is a real estate and banking attorney and specializes in representing the real estate brokerage industry. He is a broker counsel to the Real Estate Board of New York, but for the first 12 years of his career, he worked very closely with LIBOR. He teaches fair housing and legal updates for LIBOR every month. So I'll turn it over to our friend, Neil Garfinkel.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I really appreciate it. And I love to tell this story, how I got started. I started my own firm 28 years ago, and I had no clients. I literally had no clients, a real estate attorney. And I said to myself, how am I going to do business? And it occurred to me, well, real estate agents might be a good way to do that. Great referral source. So I reached out to Marianne and LIBOR, and Marianne helped me get my certification to teach. And over the years, I became chair of your legal assistance committee, your common interest ownership committee. Really, Marianne and LIBOR gave me my start, really gave me my identity. So I'm always so thankful for that opportunity. Even though I'm broker counsel to REBNY for the last 16 years, I've worked very closely with LIBOR, with NYSAR. We have a great relationship, and it really is. It's my pleasure to be here today to teach for LIBOR and to work with all of you. So I have so much to cover today. As you know, fair housing is such an important topic, so timely. We mentioned some of these things. Again, real briefly, I am the founder of something called the Real Estate Center for Success and the Toolbox for Real Estate Agent Success. I mentioned that I'm broker counsel to REBNY, and for REBNY, I created their fair housing course about 15 years ago. I co-chair their fair housing committee. I author every Friday something called Fair Housing Fridays. I sit on the New York State Real Estate Board. I'm a member of Arello, and I also sit on their fair housing committee. So I spend a lot of time in the fair housing arena, teaching, training, and so on. One of the things I want to mention is we have a lot to cover today, and I'm sure that LIBOR will share my information with you, my email, my phone, and I'd be happy to come back and we could dive deeper into some of these topics. So with that, let's just first get out there. Why is fair housing so important? Why am I so passionate? Why do I want you to be so passionate about this? Obviously, it's the law and all of those things, but I want everyone to take a step back for a second. And I want to remind you that we do an amazing thing. We collectively, I'm a real estate attorney, do transactional work. And what do you do every day? You work in helping people find what? Places to live. But more importantly, what are our basic human needs? What are our basic human needs? So we have the need for clothing and air and food, and what else? We have the need for shelter. And so remember that we are superstars. What we do every day, we help people find shelter. It's an amazing, amazing thing. If you can all agree with me on that concept, then I think you can all agree with me as well that why should anyone ever be denied shelter by virtue of what they look like? Why should anyone ever be denied shelter based on their beliefs or any of the other protected categories? So when you ask me, why fair housing? Why is this so important? Well, that's the core concept. That's what it's all about, right? We help people do this amazing thing every day. We help them find shelter, and they should never be denied the access to that shelter by virtue of being a member of a protected class. So with that in mind, we're going to do top tips today. We're going to do top fair housing tips, but we're going to focus on source of income, which is a protected category. So first of all, who's required to follow fair housing laws? The law says, interestingly, that any person who has the authority to rent, sell, or deal with applicants for or residents of a housing accommodation may be liable for unlawful practices. But I'm going to suggest to you, my first top tip, that everyone, you should assume that everyone is presumed to know these legal obligations of fair housing. And more importantly, when I'm talking to you, the managers, the owners, I would say to you that you need to make sure that everyone in your organization understands what fair housing laws are, needs to know those legal obligations. So I'm talking about your receptionist, your unlicensed employees, your support staff, personal assistants. If you're a managing agent and you're working with a co-op, you want to make sure that the door people, you want to make sure that your supers, you want to make sure that anyone that's coming in contact with a consumer understands the basic legal obligations of fair housing. Why? Because one of the things that we see particularly in the source of income realm, is testers. And testers are good, but we don't want you to fail. And if someone was to call and say, hey, do you accept Section 8, for example? And if your receptionist doesn't know what that is, then you're going to fail. So I'm telling you that my top tip, make sure that everyone in your firms well aware of what fair housing is, what the laws are, and so on. Okay, so tip one. To me, there are two core concepts of fair housing. First is treat everyone equally. Okay, so the concept is treat everyone the same way. The second piece is follow the money. And what do I mean by that? Is that in theory, the only thing we want to look at with respect to a prospective purchaser or tenant is do they have the financial wherewithal to afford this particular property? If we do those two things, if we treat everyone the same way, and we look at the concept of financial wherewithal, we will follow our fair housing laws. Now, granted, there's a lot more to that. Our fair housing laws are complex, but notwithstanding that, I want you to basically say, okay, these are the two things that I need to institute in my firms, in my brokerages, to make sure that we start at the very core. Okay, so tip one. Now, again, I said I have a lot to cover today. If you have questions, you could put them into the chat. We'll probably end about 10 of, and then I'll try to answer those questions. We'll see how many questions you have. But again, feel free to put them into the chat, and I will try to get to as many questions as possible. Okay, so how do we do tip one? What's the means of us meeting the challenges of treating everyone the same way and following the money? It's tip two. It is, I am a huge believer. I talk about this all the time. I train on this all the time. The idea that you need to build a systematic approach for your businesses. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think that the way that you accomplish that is by creating what I call checklists, forms, and templates. Okay, so what is a checklist? It's pretty straightforward, right? A list of things that you have to do. I believe that there are two types of checklists that you need. The first is what I would call non-negotiable items, things that you do on every transaction. And then the second type of checklist would be your deal checklist. So, excuse me, if you're doing a sale of a co-op, for example, then you would have a checklist that you would follow for that co-op sale. Okay, so let's go back to our non-negotiable items. What are some of the things that you would do that you always do on every transaction? Well, how about asking for an agency disclosure form, asking for a fair housing disclosure form, asking what the laws are, the fair housing laws are in the place that you're conducting your business. Are you working with another LIBOR member? Are you working with a non-LIBOR member? These are the kind of questions that we want to know on every transaction. And I think you would agree with me, right? You need to know, who are you representing? That's our agency question. How am I getting paid? If you go outside of the LIBOR environment, you need to have an agreement of compensation to make sure you're going to get paid. So we need to have those checklists. And then we support those checklists with forms, the agency disclosure form, financial questionnaire, and so on. And then to round that out, I strongly recommend that you build templates, communication tools. So it could be the form of an email or a letter, a script that you use. And the idea is that you build that once, and then you can use it over and over and over again. There's no need to, every time you give an agency disclosure form, to write an email, hey, there's this thing called the agency disclosure form or the fair housing disclosure form. The idea is that you can build your template once, then you can simply send it out. You can make it better as time goes on. The great news is you can start doing this today. You can start building your checklist by non-negotiable things and so on. And we're going to see, as we talk about a lot of these other tips, we're going to come back to this concept of building the systematic approach. So true or false, pop quiz. You can ask someone what their occupation and titles are. So what do you think? Obviously, I can't see you. You can see me. But I'm guessing some of you are saying, yes, you can ask this question. Some of you are saying, well, no, I'm not sure if you can ask this question. So the answer is, it really depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on where you are located. So tip number 3 is the idea that you need to know the protected classes in the location where you are doing your business, where the property is located. The way that our fair housing laws work is that it creates certain protected classes. We're going to go through those shortly. What I will tell you that in New York City, occupation is a protected class. You're not supposed to ask someone what your title is. It makes sense to me. That makes sense to me from a fair housing perspective overall. Why? Well, if you think about it, right, if I was to just say to you something to the effect of, I have 2 people and I'm going to sit them in front of a room, and all I'm going to tell you is one is a paralegal, one is an attorney. If I did that, and I said, you have to decide who you're going to rent to based on the title, who would you pick? It's very likely you might pick the attorney just based on the profession. But I will tell you that I have lots of paralegals that work in my firm, and they are paid equally, if not more, than my attorneys in some cases. So you would have picked wrong if you just picked based on the idea of a title or an occupation. And that's the concept behind protecting the class of occupation. Okay, so it goes back to the concept of follow the money. Why does it matter what someone's title is, what their position is? The idea is that you want to look at, again, doing the same things over and over again and following the money. And I just want to go back to the slide. So with respect to our systematic approach, if we say that we want to treat everyone the same way and we want to follow the money, what does the systematic approach do for us? If we have a checklist, we're going to do the same things over and over again. We're going to treat everyone the same way. If we do the same things over and over again, we treat everyone the same way. If as part of that approach, we're evaluating, we're looking for the financial wherewithal, well, our templates, our forms give us the ability to do that. Okay, so tip number 3, you need to know the protected classes in the place that you are, that the property is located, where you're doing your business. How are our fair housing laws created? Well, we have our fair housing laws are created at the federal level. The federal level, the federal law creates certain protected classes. We go back to 1866. Color and race are protected classes. Then in 1968, we added to that. We added to that with the Fair Housing Act, and we added familial status, for example. Now, the way our laws are set up is that we have, New York State can add to our federal laws. So there can be an overlay. And then, in fact, New York City can do that. And our more local governments, Nassau County, Suffolk County. So this is a chart. I encourage you, take a picture of it, print it out. I can send it to you. You want to have this readily available to you. Because if I was to say to you, ask you that question again, can you ask someone what their occupation is? You would need to say, okay, let me pull out my chart. Let me find out where I'm conducting my business, and then let me evaluate whether, in fact, that would be a protected class. And that's, in fact, what we see. New York City, lawful occupation is a protected class. One other thing I want to point out, there are exceptions to fair housing laws. We're going to talk about that, but there is never an exception for race and color. You can never discriminate against someone by virtue of their race or color. Just a reminder that, and by the way, I have no problem. I would actually recommend that you build your script when you give the fair housing, when you talk about fair housing, when you first meet someone, when you give them the New York State Anti-Discrimination and Fair Housing form, when you give them this form, you can give them the chart. And the reason why we do that, the reason why I say that is, number one, it is so important to talk to the consumer, to build up a level of trust, to build that relationship. And I think the way that you do that is by talking about the agency disclosure form. I have a class that I call using the agency disclosure form as your best form of marketing. Well, I would say the same thing here. You're required to give these forms. You're required to talk about them, but do you really explain them? Do you really take the time to talk to the consumer about that? And to me, that's so important. So I'm going to recommend that as part of your that script, that systematic approach, make sure that you're talking about it the same way. And we're going to see later on that this is going to come into effect later on as well with some of the other tips that I have. Okay, let's talk. So we'll go back for 1 second. What do we see here? We see lawful source of income is a protected category. So we see it's protected at the state level, at the city level, at the local levels. So our next tip is, what does lawful source of income mean? What does this mean? So it is a protected class under New York State human rights laws. I want to explain to you first what it is not. Source of income does not mean that, for example, if a landlord is charging $3,000 a month and a voucher recipient comes to them with a $1,500 voucher, that they have to reduce their monthly rental to $1,500. So that's not what our lawful source of income laws say. Our lawful source of income simply say that you, as a housing provider or participant, you need to consider all lawful sources of income when qualifying someone. Said a different way, simply saying to someone, well, what's your salary? That's not acceptable. The idea is that you need to look at the full financial picture of a prospective purchaser, tenant, and so on. So lawful source of income could be a lot of things. It could be, as we indicate here, child support, alimony, Social Security, any type of public assistance. It could be trust income. And then it could also be the various programs that are intended to assist potential renters. So it could be Section 8 or LINKS or HASA. There are a number of programs out there. Some of them in New York State and New York City. Again, Section 8, probably the most common, the one that you're most familiar with. There's something called state FEPs and city FEPs. EHV, emergency housing vouchers, SOTA, SOTA, one-time housing vouchers. The idea is that there are lots of programs out there. And so I want you to be particularly aware of them, because the law also says that, look, there's not an expectation that you will know about every program, but there is an expectation that you will understand how to work with those various programs. So I'm sure you're all aware that there is a nonprofit fair housing agency called the Housing Rights Initiative. the Housing Rights Initiative has brought 4 cases in New York State since 2021. The first case that they brought was against 88 landlords, real estate brokers, and property managers. And so the first grouping of cases was based on the refusal, could it be the broker, the property manager, the landlord, to either show properties, accept applications, accept vouchers, all based on lawful source of income. So the case focused solely on that. And then in May of 2022, HRI brought another case, and that accused 28 real estate brokers, landlords, and property managers, specifically of focusing on credit or multiples on the need for having a certain rent qualification. And all of those cases focused specifically on landlords, again, or brokers, using those things as proxies for turning away someone who had a voucher. The next case was brought in May 25 of 2022, and that one focused on source of income in condos and co-ops. And so we see brokers saying, for example, well, a voucher won't work in a particular co-op, or the board won't approve it, and so on. And then finally, most recent case a couple of weeks ago, this was focused on Section 8. It focused on Long Island brokers. And if you read the document, and if you reach out to me, I'll share that document with you. We see the most blatant forms of fair housing violations with respect to source of income. Oh, I'm sorry, my landlord won't take that. Or no, this landlord has said no before. Those are direct quotes from this case. So we know that there are fair housing agencies out there like HRI. They are testing you to make sure that you're following the law. And so, again, the importance of this class, and I know I'm speaking fast because I have so much that I want to cover, but the idea is to give you these tips, give you these background things that you can do to make sure that you're complying with the law. So let's go to some lawful source of income specific tips that I think would be helpful for you. The first tip is what happens when someone calls you and says, do you accept Section 8? Do you accept Section 8? What do you do? So here's what I'm going to recommend. The first thing that I want you to do is say, we will consider all lawful source of income when qualifying a tenant or a purchaser. Now, in order to do that, you need to go back to the systematic approach. Someone calls, take out your checklist. What do we do when we get this question? So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to simply say, we will consider all lawful sources of income when qualifying a tenant or a purchaser. What do you do next? So what's tip 6? It is follow your system. So your system should say, okay, prospective tenant, I am going to now send you my application and my financial questionnaire. Now, what's the point of this? Well, first of all, I want you to basically stop the conversation. What I found, and in listening to a lot of these tapes and so on, is that what happens is the tester, or it could also be, it could be truly someone that does have a voucher. Either way, they start asking you lots of questions. They start asking your, it could be your receptionist, or it could be one of your agents, lots of questions. From my perspective, I want you to follow your system, which means that we will consider all lawful sources of income, and then you send out your application, which you send to everyone, and your financial questionnaire, which you send to everyone. What are you doing? You're treating everyone the same way. We're going back to our core concept. We're going to treat everyone the same way. We're going to follow the money. What did we just do by doing this? Someone calls you, says, I'm interested in the property. What do? You follow your system. You send the same application and financial questionnaire to everyone. You ask them for their financial information. I promise you, if you follow this path, that if you are tested, or if you're, or again, there's a legitimate tenant coming to you, you are going to follow the law 100% of the time. So, a couple of other points. Another tip, though, your financial questionnaire has to be legal, meaning that if it only asks, what is your salary? That's not going to be okay. You need to make sure that your financial questionnaire, the way you qualify everyone, gives you or gives the recipient the ability to fill in all of their financial sources of income. Okay, so again, what are we doing? If we follow this system, we are going to follow the law, because what have we done? We've treated everyone the same way. We've gathered the same information from everyone, and so on. Okay, so now let's assume that we follow that path and someone comes back to you and says, well, I have a voucher. What do you do then? I want you to, 1, request a copy of the voucher. I want you to, 2, request the name of the caseworker. And then 3, I want you to spend some time researching that program. Most of the programs that are out there, you can find lots of information about them. You can go to a website and you can look into what the requirements are, because as I said before, even though you are not expected to be an expert in these programs, you are expected to understand the various concepts, what is required of that program, and more importantly, you are expected to understand that everyone needs to consider all of those lawful sources of income when qualifying someone. I get this question a lot. There seems to be a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation, again, of what lawful source of income is. And so a lot of people say, I have been told, an agent says, I have been told that I can't ask a tenant what their income is. That is blatantly wrong, okay? Your job is to help qualify a prospective tenant. That's what the landlord is asking you to do, assuming you're representing the landlord. So to be clear, what I think the misunderstanding is the idea that if you're only asking, again, for salary, that's where the problem is. Ask for all of the lawful source of income. That's what the law says. Okay, tip number 9, specifically with respect to source of income. There is no such thing as program housing. What I mean by that is sometimes I hear, well, this property is not set up for Section 8, or this building is not a Section 8 building, or this program doesn't work there. Remember, what does the law say? The law simply says that everyone needs to consider all lawful source of income. A housing provider needs to consider all lawful source of income when qualifying someone. So in theory, every property is covered by this law. So really important to understand. Now, granted, there may be certain buildings that have a certain amount of tenants that do have Section 8. There may be landlords that are accustomed to that, but I need to be very clear with you that every landlord needs to consider all lawful source of income when qualifying someone. You as an agent need to consider all of those lawful source of income when qualifying anyone. Okay, so I mentioned before there was an HRI case that talked about using multiples or credit scores as a proxy for rejecting someone. This is really important. You need to understand how the programs work. The recipient, the voucher recipient or prospective voucher recipient, will make an application to the issuing agency. They will be vetted and qualified by that issuing agency. So what we talk about is the idea that they will ultimately be approved based on their income and potentially what they can afford. There are some voucher programs that cover the full amount of the rent. There are some voucher programs, for example, Section 8, which only cover a portion of the rent. And then there is an expectation that the recipient will pay or provide the balance of the money, the rent. And so the question that I'm frequently asked is, okay, can we ask, for example, for a credit score? And it becomes a little bit complicated, but number one, if the voucher is paying the full amount of the rent, then you cannot ask for that. You cannot ask for a credit score. Why? Well, we're not interested in the credit score of the recipient. And you would not ask the federal government or a housing agency what their credit score is. So their credit score becomes irrelevant. Now, remember I started with the idea that you need to treat everyone the same way. What's interesting about that is that you do need to treat everyone the same way. However, if you are going to have someone, a voucher recipient, contact you, you need to understand that your path, the way that you're going to treat that voucher recipient, is going to be a little bit different than the way that you would treat a non-voucher recipient. Now, within that path, it's important to understand that you're still going to treat all of the voucher recipients the same way. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that, again, you're not going to, if you have a policy of asking for a credit score for all of your prospective tenants, the voucher recipient that has a voucher that covers the full amount of the rental, you're not going to ask them for a credit score, okay? To be clear, so you are treating that person a little bit differently. However, again, you are then going to make sure that you treat all of your voucher recipients the same way. Now we get the question, okay, what about the voucher recipient where you are going to, the voucher recipient is going to pay a portion of the rent? Can you run a credit score there? And the answer is, it kind of depends, because again, the issuing agency that's issuing the voucher, they've also vetted the recipient to make sure that they can cover their portion as well. So what the agencies are, and it's unclear, the takeaway that I would give to you is, if you're going to run a credit score, you need to have a very legitimate reason. For example, someone has been bankruptcy 10 times or whatever for rejecting them. I will tell you that you need to be very careful as it relates to a voucher recipient, because again, I go back to the concept that they have already been vetted by the issuing agency. So I want you to be very, very careful there. Tip 11. So I get this a lot when I teach fair housing. Hey, my landlord is not going to take this recipient. They're not going to accept this. So here's the bottom line. I don't care who that is. I don't care if there are exceptions to fair housing laws with respect to whether an individual needs to follow fair housing laws. The takeaway, the important part of this tip, is that you, as a real estate licensee, always have to follow fair housing laws. You must always follow fair housing laws. So let's cover exceptions real quickly, okay? Because there are exceptions to fair housing laws. As I said before, there is never an exception for race or color. You can never, an individual owner can never discriminate based on race or color. And you as a real estate licensee also, there's never an exception. Under the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act, there are exceptions set up. So depending on the number of units you own and so on, whether you are an owner-occupied 1 to 4 family home, some religious organizations and private clubs. And then if we look at New York state law, we see that if you're a 1 or 2 family owner-occupied building, you don't own more than 3 units and so on, you may have the right, you as the individual owner may have the right not to follow fair housing laws, provided, and this is important, provided that the owner can never advertise that. So they can never say, oh, no children welcome, and they can't make it public. They can't say out loud, well, I don't want to take children, for example. So by virtue of that, and just a reminder in tip 12, you as a broker, because if that individual owner says, I don't want to take children, what have they done? They've made it public. So my takeaway for you is that you can never participate in that discriminatory practice, even if the individual owner has the legal right to do that. So what do you say? If someone comes to you and says, look, I'm not going to take Section 8, your response is going to need to be that, I'm sorry, I can't work with you. I'm not going to be able to work with you. And you should check, the individual owner should check with your attorney to make sure that you follow all of those laws. Okay, I want to cover a couple of scenarios now as we go through our tips. So the first scenario, a buyer comes to you and they say to you, I only want to see homes in Orthodox Jewish communities. Can you accommodate this request? So think about that for a second. Someone comes to you and says, look, I only want to live in this particular type of area. Can you accommodate this request? And the interesting thing is, when I started teaching this class, I would have answered many years ago, yes. I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind for a couple of reasons. Number one, importantly, I looked at the Newsday investigation. And what did Newsday investigation show? Well, it showed widespread fair housing violations, many of which I felt were created by statistical analysis, meaning that if the broker was left to their own devices, the agent was left to their own devices to pick where they were going to show a prospective homeowner properties, they were going to show them in areas that were predominantly dominated by people who looked like that particular person, like the consumer. So whether there was an overt intent to discriminate or whether it was subconscious, statistically, what Newsday showed was that when the agent was left to make their choice, they were going to potentially statistically violate fair housing laws. So my concept says to me, look, if someone comes to me and says, I want to live in an Orthodox Jewish community, my response is, if I do that, I am going to be using my own thought process to steer you to a particular place based on religion. I can't do that. So what I'm going to say to you is that if a consumer comes to you and says something like what I used in my example, your response is, you know what, you consumer, you pick the geographical boundaries. You let me know, for example, what town do you want to live in? And then based on that town, I will show you properties. I will give you lots of opportunity there. Now, I have something called the crystal ball theory, and the crystal ball theory goes something to the effect of a consumer comes to you and they think that you're going to be able to offer them or find a place for them to live, and they're going to be happy to live there happily ever after. And I think we all know that you don't have a crystal ball. You don't have the ability to tell someone whether they're going to be happy there. My point is that you really need to let the consumer set the boundaries, because truthfully, you can only offer opportunities, but ultimately you're not going to be able to tell the consumer that they're going to be happy there. So when someone comes to us and says, can you show me homes that are of this ethnicity or this race or so on, the answer is no. You tell me from a geographic perspective, specific boundaries where you want to look at property, I will find that property for you. So next scenario, I'm sure this happens to all of you. You're standing outside of a property, outside of a building, outside of a co-op. You're asked the question, who lives here? What should you do? Well, the first thing that I would say is this question, or how we deal with this question, it starts well before we're meeting with the consumer. It starts when you give that fair housing disclosure form, when you talk to the consumer. So the idea is that when someone says to you, hey, who lives in this building? Your response is, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that. It would violate fair housing laws. Remember when we first met and I gave you that fair housing disclosure form? The importance of this is now you can point back in time. So you have a relationship with the consumer. You want to be able to say, look, I talked about this with you. I can't answer the conversation. And the idea is to shut the conversation down. Right? You want to stop that conversation, because my experience is that the longer you go on, the more that you talk to the consumer about a question like this, the more likely you are in getting yourself into trouble, in violating fair housing laws, because you're going to say something you shouldn't say. So again, your systematic approach to the way we conduct our business. If someone asks you a question that you believe violates fair housing laws, you stop the conversation. You say, I cannot answer that question. Now, Again, you have a relationship with this consumer. So how do you deal with that? Well, here's what I would recommend. I would say to the consumer, look, I can't answer that question, but again, I don't have a crystal ball. You need to decide if you're going to be comfortable living here. So why don't you walk around the neighborhood? You do your investigation. You sit in the lobby of a building if that's appropriate, so that you can figure out whether you feel comfortable living there. Okay, so now we have scenario 3. So Bob Broker is representing a landlord renting an apartment. Bob has a potential tenant, and the landlord asks Bob if the tenants are Hispanic. What should he do? Well, it's the same answer, right? It's the same answer, folks, right? Which is, I can't answer that question. It is illegal for me to answer that question. Now, I want to mention to you the real case, because this is based on a real case, and it reinforces the idea of not answering the question. In the real case, we had an owner who lived in Florida, was renting a property in New York, and the owner asked the broker in New York, are the tenants Black? That was the question. Are the tenants Black? And the agent said, yes, but you can't ask that question. There was a fair housing, the tenants never were offered a lease, and they brought a fair housing violation against the owner. The owner was fined $80,000, which is appropriate, and it could have even been more and should have been more. Here's the thing, though. The agent was also found guilty of a fair housing violation by simply, and this is what the judge said, by simply answering the question. The agent facilitated and participated in the fair housing violation. So when I say to you, managers, owners, you need to reinforce the idea that if you are asked a question, your agents are asked a question, anyone is asked a question that you believe violates fair housing laws, the response is, I can't answer that question. Do not answer that question. If you do, you are ultimately going to, I promise you, wind up in some type of fair housing violation. So now let's go on to scenario 4. Bob receives a call from a tenant that has a TBC subsidy program. What should Bob do? So this is a little bit different. The first thing I would say to you, the audience, is, do you know what a TBC subsidy program is? You can't, because I made it up. It doesn't exist. What is the point of this question? I want you to remember that just because you're professionals doesn't mean that you know the answer to every question. So if you don't know the answer to a question, it's okay to say, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer. This is a little bit different than our question of, does this violate fair housing laws? This can be a question that has nothing to do with fair housing, but my experience says that if you don't know the answer to a question, even if you think you're supposed to know the answer to that question, don't answer the question. There is nothing wrong with saying, as a professional, as an expert, I don't know. I say it, I say it all the time. I'm asked questions, I don't know the answer. I'm sorry, let me find out, let me get back to you. So understand the distinction between ending a conversation that you believe violates fair housing laws with ending a conversation or answering a question where you say, I just don't know what you're asking me. That's okay. Now, if you do that, you could say, well, let me get back to you. It is not okay to ghost people, meaning that if someone calls you and says, do you accept Section 8? And you don't call that person back, right? So not responding is just as bad as responding the wrong way. Now, so we've got Bob right now. Bob, after going through all this, is very concerned about fair housing violations. He wants to create best practices. What should Bob do? Okay, so we're going to kind of go back and we're going to go through a couple of things. So the first thing is, know your fair housing laws. Use the chart, right? I want you to take a picture of that chart. Give the disclosure form, build your structure, build the way that you conduct your business around the idea that the consumer, that you have to disclose, you have to provide these things, right? So how do you do that? Again, you need to know what the fair housing laws are in the particular place that you're conducting your business. They're not all the same. If you look at the chart, again, we see that New York City lawful source of occupation is different than any place else. So you need to know, if you're doing a deal in New York City and someone wants to know, is this person the vice president? You can't talk about that. It's not relevant. So make sure you know those fair housing laws. Make sure you use the chart, okay? And then give the disclosure form as your baseline. Number two, never answer a question if you believe it violates fair housing laws. We just covered that, right? Who lives in this building? If you don't know the answer, if you think it violates fair housing laws, don't answer it. If you don't know the answer to a question, don't answer the question. You need to have a systematic method of conducting your business. You need to build those checklists. If I was running a brokerage, I would build a system that everyone follows. Why? Well, you have all these agents and they're running around and they're conducting business, and you never know where one of them is going to make a mistake. It's like having lots of little rain clouds all over the place, and you never know where one of them is going to create a lot of thunder, lightning, and rain for you. So the only way, from my perspective, that you can really do that is you need to control the way that business is conducted. And I believe that you have the absolute legal right to do that. You have an obligation to supervise, and you have an obligation to create systems that are compliant with the law. And the only way that you can do that is build your checklists, build your templates, build your forms libraries, and that's how you do that. You need to have good record keeping. You need to document everything. You need to encourage your agents to do this so that they take really good notes. The law doesn't say, for example, that you have to offer every tenant that comes to you, or rather, if a landlord doesn't want to offer a lease to someone, there's no requirement to provide reasons why you don't do that. But you should document, why was there a decision not to offer a lease? Was it based on not enough income, and so on? Obviously, if those reasons are illegal, then you don't want to be working with that person. So you need to have good record keeping, why you're doing the things you do. Obtain objective information from the consumer. We talked about steering, this concept of the consumer. Let the consumer guide you. What are they looking for? Number 6, then let them establish those geographical boundaries. Avoid steering. Let them set for you specifically where they want to live. And then once you have that, then offer lots of choices. So once you have established that concept, that geographical construct, then offer them lots of choices within there. You want to have very good procedures concerning follow-up and how you treat people, courtesies. Why? Well, there are cases out there. There were testers and they were sent into an office, and depending on what you look like, you were either offered a seat in the conference room, your coat was taken, you were offered a bottle of water, but if you didn't look the right way, you were made to stand for 20 minutes before someone would talk to you. No one asked you, can I take your coat? Can I offer you a bottle of water? Can I offer you a seat? And so on. Again, no ghosting. You need to make sure that there's no law that says that if someone sends you an email or a phone call that you have to follow up with them, you have to return that. I will tell you that in your business, number one, professionally, I would encourage you to do so. You never know when the next $1 million listing is on the other end of that email or that phone. And again, more importantly, if they can establish, if it can be established that you respond to certain people but not others, I promise you that that is just as worse as responding inappropriately or in violating the law. Respond to everyone. You want to make sure that you have your fair housing logo on all of your advertisements. It is to the right of the screen, but if you can Google, do HUD fair housing logo. There are all types of fair housing logos that you can download and you can use. Now, there is a presumption that if you are using this fair housing logo on your advertising, that you are following fair housing laws. Now, that doesn't mean that you have a get out of jail free card, that if you use the logo and then your advertising violates fair housing laws, that it exempts you. But there is a presumption on your advertising, if you don't have the fair housing logo, that you're not following fair housing laws. So I recommend you put that on everything that you do. And then finally, education. I cannot, we covered an enormous amount and I rushed through a lot. And if you take my fair housing class that we offer, it's 3 hours. You will see that we never have enough time to cover most of the topics that we, or expand on the topic the way I'd like to. So it's incumbent upon you to make sure that you are following fair housing laws. And the way that you do that is through education. Educate yourselves, educate your really everyone in your business. It's the only way, from my perspective, that you can make sure that your people, that the people that work for you are following the law. It has become so complex. The laws are constantly changing. Just this, we just scratched the surface of source of income. I'm telling you that these programs are complex. They're different. Each one is a little bit different. Whether one program limits your brokerage fee, whether one program requires you to get your own fee, charge your own brokerage fee, and so on. So just really good examples of the way that you need to continue to educate yourself. And then finally, adopting these suggestions, these policies after a complaint is made against you, it's not going to help. You need to do these things now. And so I encourage you, and I think the good news is that everything we talked about this morning, or this afternoon rather, it's immensely doable. You can start today. You can start building your checklist today, and so on. So I'd love to answer any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now. And I'm just going to take a quick look at the Q&A. So let me just take a quick lead. Okay, so we answered that question. Okay, so one of the questions that was asked, can we get the slides? I generally don't share my slides. However, I'm going to share my information with everyone, and you can feel free to reach out to me. And if you have specific slides that you'd like or questions, I'm going to encourage you to ask me those questions. I am happy to try to answer them. One final thing, I mentioned the Toolbox for Real Estate Agent Success. It is a free service, and in the Toolbox, it offers a checklist builder, forms, and templates. All you need to do is go to the Toolbox for Real Estate Agent Success. You can sign up. There is, all of those things are free. They will always be free for you. So I'm going to type that into the chat box as well. You have my information there. And let me see if there are any other questions. So give me 1 second. Okay. So you can take my class. I teach monthly at LIBOR. So I'm sure that I'm teaching next month. So just check with LIBOR. Do we have a sample of good rental and financial applications? So again, on the Toolbox, we do have some forms. Importantly, I would speak to my company's attorney, my broker. If you're the manager, I would collaborate. What I would do is, I don't know if LIBOR has a standard financial form. They're definitely out there, and I would build that form. And then again, I would have everyone use that form accordingly. Okay, so if an unlicensed admin in an office gets a call about accepting of vouchers, how should they answer? Okay, we're going to go back. I don't remember which tip it was, but there's a very clear progression on how you do this. The first thing is, the response is, we will consider all lawful sources of income when qualifying someone. So that's step one. And I'm going to say it again. You should write this down. We will consider all lawful sources of income when qualifying someone. Step two is then to say, let me send you my application, my rental application, and my financial questionnaire. So you're doing the same things over and over and over again. And then the third step, if they come back to you and they say, well, I have a voucher, then what you do is say, okay, please send me a copy of the voucher. Please send me the name of the caseworker. And then I would look up the information about that voucher to familiarize yourself with that. If you do that, if you follow that procedure, what have you done? Well, you've treated everyone the same way, and you've looked to to the source of incomes or collected the various sources of incomes to make sure that they qualify. Okay, other questions? Anyone have any other questions for me? Okay. Terrific. I can't believe we got that all done.
I know.
Right.
Great information. And as I'm listening, I'm thinking to myself, I have to check your availability for May. I think we need you back so that everybody can digest it and maybe bring back some questions, get a new audience. I did want to tell everyone also, as a Realtor member of LIBOR, if you go to lirealtor.com/fair housing, there's a great resource page for you with videos, NAR's Fair Haven simulation video that is excellent. I really encourage you to take it. And I invite everyone on April 28th, LIBOR will have a member signature event free to all members with Bill Dedman. He was the investigator behind the Newsday Long Island Divided expose. He is our speaker, along with two NAR fair housing specialists who are coming in from Washington. It's at the mansion at Oyster Bay in Woodbury, and it's free to all LIBOR members. I put the link in there, but if you go to LIBOR Education and search under that date, April 28th, you can register. Neil, I hope you can attend too. I'd love for you to be there. I can put you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to be in California, but
Okay.
but yes, thank you. And I
Okay.
would love to attend. I mean, you have such great events, and I guess I would leave everyone, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't come to these events, but reach out to us. LIBOR has an amazing staff, great faculty. I'm proud to be part of that faculty, but we're here to help. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. And thank you particularly to Neil. And I mean it, I am going to reach out to you for
My
part two.
pleasure. My
Okay.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Be
Have a
well,
good-
everyone.
Have a good day.
Bye.